Has the time finally come to tear down monuments to the Confederacy? As you know, it's a divisive question, and as Mo Rocca now shows us, it's complicated.
General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was one of the best-known commanders of the Confederate Army and a Virginian, so it's not a big surprise that he's memorialized here in this stained glass window at Roanoke's Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. That is, until you meet its congregation.
Good morning, Fifth Avenue.
The Stonewall Jackson window has been part of this black church for 125 years, surviving a fire in 1959 that destroyed the rest of the church.
This was a monument to the future of the African American race.
But third-generation member Joyce Bolden says the window is not about General Jackson, but Jackson the man, who before the war led a Bible study for his slaves, including the parents of an early pastor.
I believe it's being memorialized for what Stonewall Jackson was as a human being and as a man of Christ, of faith. He defied all the laws of the South by educating his slaves. He taught them to read and write.
The man fought for slavery. That is the man. Can we separate the man from his military work?
Current pastor Vernie Bolden isn't so sure. He joined us along with church elder Ray Williams. And if Stonewall Jackson were right here, what would you say to him?
You picked the wrong side of history, man.
I would thank him for educating his slaves.
I think that's very important.
Yeah.
So it's complicated.
The conversation over the window continues, but across the country, a legion of Confederate monuments has fallen. Some after the 2015 Charleston massacre of 9 black churchgoers by a white supremacist. Then many more came down after white supremacists used the proposed removal of a Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, Virginia, as pretext for a rally last month that shocked the nation.
We're having, once again, for whatever it is, the 17th time, a major racial reckoning in America, and we don't know exactly where this one's going.
According to Yale University Civil War historian David Blight, most early Confederate monuments were part of an effort to recast the secessionist cause as a noble one that supposedly had little to do with maintaining slavery. The first major monument was to Stonewall Jackson, unveiled in Richmond, Virginia in 1875.
It was a big coming out. It was the first time Confederate flags were used on any scale. Blacks were only allowed to participate in this at the very back of the line.
The message, says Blight, was clear.
We're back in the Union now, Virginians were saying, white Virginians were saying, we're loyal again and patriotic to the United States, but we're going to show you who our heroes are.
Even so, Blight doesn't support the wholesale removal of Confederate monuments.
I want to make it clear, I am for removal of some Confederate monuments. The time has come. Not all of them, not every single one of them, certainly not in cemeteries. I just want the process to be historical, deliberative, and based on research.
And including the people who live there.
Yes. If all politics is local, all memory is also local.
A memorial landscape turned minefield is familiar terrain for David Blight and Yale University. Was there some resistance to changing the name?
Oh yes, there was resistance to name changing among alumni, among some.
Earlier this year, the university renamed a dormitory dedicated to former Vice President John C. Calhoun, citing what it called Calhoun's primary legacy as one of the 19th century's most ardent defenders of slavery. But determining a historical figure's primary legacy is where things get tricky. I'm sure you've heard this, but this university has a very conspicuous connection to someone who made a lot of money trading slaves. And his name is?
Elihu Yale. Yeah, well, I can assure you, as our previous dean said, the name Yale is not on the table.
Yes, Yale is named for Elihu Yale, a slave trader. So, where to draw the line? After all, 10 of our first 12 presidents were slave owners. Some warn against drawing lines at all.
We need to remember this nation exists by the blood and the sacrifice and the courage of many, many men. Many got it correctly, many misgot it.
Virginia Tech history professor emeritus James Robertson isn't new to this debate. In 1961, President Kennedy tapped Robertson to lead the Civil War Centennial Commission.
We need to learn from the mistakes others made, just as well as we need to be inspired by the good things that good people have done.
And Robertson believes there was a lot of good in Confederate General Robert E. Lee.
People forget that after the Civil War, Lee became the greatest voice for reconciliation in this country. He preached peace and harmony.
Robertson joined us on Richmond's Monument Avenue, a grand boulevard in the once Confederate capital, designed to pay tribute to the rebel leaders. This looks pretty clearly like he's being honored for his military service, not as a peacemaker.
It certainly does. My regret is that Lee is not in civilian clothing, which he would have been in his last 5 years.
Half a mile from Lee is the Jefferson Davis Monument, a tribute as much to the secessionist government, it seems, as it is to the former Confederate president.
So Davis leads the South into a war for its independence, very much aware that he was fighting to keep slavery legal. So if one has to go, this is probably the one to go.
If we look down and we see Stonewall Jackson way in the distance, we see all this green space. Is all that green space one solution?
Absolutely. There's plenty of room for monuments here. Monuments commemorating other aspects of the war. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass.
But simply adding statues of African American icons isn't a solution, says Brian Stevenson. He still remembers what it felt like seeing Confederate monuments as a kid.
I always thought, despite the fact that they were copper or bronze, that they were screaming at me. They were saying, I don't belong here. This is not your land. You are still subordinate.
Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, is turning a light on one of America's darkest post-Civil War chapters, the nearly 4,000 documented lynchings that happened in the Old South between 1877 and 1950.
We are looking at jars of soil that have been collected from the sites of lynchings that took place in the state of Alabama.
363 in Alabama alone.
There's even photography where you'll see thousands of people gathered in a space while someone is being hanged. People would come to these lynchings and they would drink lemonade and whiskey.
And now these jars will be part of a museum that Stevenson is opening, along with a national memorial to victims of lynching next year in Montgomery. He's not worried if it makes some people uncomfortable.
I do think that we need to increase the shame quotient in America. I don't think shame is a bad thing. I think it actually moves you and pushes you to think differently about things. And I don't frankly think we've expressed our shame about slavery. I want us to talk about what it means to honor someone who did something dishonorable.
Which brings us back to Roanoke and the Stonewall Jackson window that survived that fire so many years ago. Joyce Bolden doesn't expect others to see it as she does.
When I die off and there's no memory of the origins of this window, it probably will be removed.
Until that day, she sees the window not as a tribute to the Confederacy, but as an unlikely connection to her own history.
When I see this one day, I see the past of the original church. I see it every time I walk in because I grew up around that one day. Nobody else might not see that because they didn't grow up in the frame church that I grew up in.
For her, it's complicated.